Committee of the whole House to take into consideration a bill to be intituled Bill number 112, an act to amend the Conflict of Interest Act. Is it the pleasure, would you like to bring a stranger onto the floor?
I would like permission to bring a stranger
permission
onto the floor.
granted?
Granted.
It's a really low chair.
Thank you, and if you wouldn't mind, once you get settled there, just stating your name and position for the record.
Joanne McKinnon, Legislative Assistant for the Office of the Third Party.
Great.
Well, thank you. And now, would you like to give an overview of the bill?
I would. Thank you,
Okay,
Chair.
Great.
So this act is a document that provides the amendments that implement all of the recommendations made by the Conflict of Interest Commissioner in his 2015 annual report. In that report, the Commissioner stated, and I quote, "This Act has been in place since 1999. It is modelled on the legislation in Ontario, and while the legislation in Ontario, as well as that in other provinces and in the House of Commons, has evolved since 1999, this Act has never been amended. With this in mind, I undertook a review of the legislation in other Canadian jurisdictions, and in my opinion, that is, the opinion of the Commissioner, the operation and administration of the Act could be improved with the inclusion of some specific provisions that have been adopted in other jurisdictions." End quote. We based our legislation on the Commissioner's recommendations, which include more clearly defined private interests, lowering the threshold of allowable gifts from $500 to $200, allowing private citizens to make a complaint to the Commissioner, extending the cooling-off period for ministers from 6 months to 12 months, and implementing a mandatory review of the Act after each general election. In addition, it provides minor clarifications on issues such as the reimbursement for costs of establishing a blind trust, disclosure of corporate interests, and members' pension plans. Our bill has been guided entirely by the Conflict of Interest Commissioner's recommendations. We were tempted to make some of the provisions more restrictive, for example, extending the cooling-off period even further, but in the end we felt we needed to respect the authority of the Commissioner on these matters and merely act on his recommendations in their entirety. Thank you, Chair.
And thank you, Member. Is it the pleasure of the committee that the bill be now read clause by clause? All right, we'll commence with that. The Minister of Education, Early Learning and Culture.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So, when this bill was tabled, I seem to recall that you had made a comment, so I'm speaking now to the honourable member from the Charlottetown Parkdale. You had made a comment that you had prepared this legislation and that you were anxious to compare it to legislation that we had tabled around the same time. You recall that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so I guess I have some curiosity in respect of how all this came to be and why it would have been that you would have made the comment in the way that you had made it. And when I ask that specifically, I want to give the context, which is to say that in April of 2017, the Premier, who was then the Minister of Justice, received a letter from the Speaker, who was chair of the Standing Committee on Legislative Management, enclosing both a copy of the report of the Commissioner that you just referred to there a moment ago, and a draft bill, which is ultimately the bill that we tabled, and asked that we move that legislation forward on behalf of the committee. Later on, excuse me, the 17th of January 2018, I received a letter from the Honourable Peter Bevan Baker, and I'm going to read from this letter because it's just in light of the comment that was made, I find it quite interesting. And so in it he says, "Congratulations on your recent appointment to Minister of Justice and Public Safety and Attorney General. I look forward to working with you in this new capacity. I am writing today about amendments to the Conflict of Interest Act, which I believe would fall under your new department. As you know, in his 2015 annual report, the Conflict of Interest Commissioner made a number of recommendations to modernize the Act. I've been hoping that government would act on those recommendations and I've brought up the issue in question period, but have been given no assurance that government intends to implement the recommendations. I believe these amendments need to move forward, and I've begun work on a private member's bill. However, in the spirit of collaboration, I want to contact you first to ask if it's government's intention to proceed on the recommendations, and if so, would you be willing to work with the Office of the Third Party on the amendments? I appreciate that we all like to keep our legislative plans to ourselves, but it would be inefficient to have Legislative Council working on the same project for both of our offices. As you can imagine, I am quite keen to begin work. If I don't hear back from you by the end of next week, I will assume that government is not planning to move forward on the recommendations, and I will begin providing instructions to Legislative Council. So, I wrote back and I indicated that we did intend to proceed with legislation in this sitting, and ultimately we tabled this bill. And so what's really troubling to me is that the comment and the way that it was made cast an aspersion to say that this was something that you had differences with, the way you had differences in the substance of your bill versus what was being put forward, and attributed that to myself as the Minister of Justice. And really what we had put forward came from the committee, chaired by the Speaker, and came forward at his request. So I guess what I'm kind of wondering is there an issue with the committee and its procedure, or how did we get to the point where we're making a comment like that to introduce legislation in the face of a clear chain of correspondence that sets out a desire to work together between two parties for the betterment of everybody involved?
Member from Charlottetown Parkdale.
Thank you, Chair. I guess there's two different questions in there. I think the first one is in terms of content of the recommendations and stuff coming out of legislative management. I can't speak to that because that is a committee which meets in camera, and I'm not privy to the content of that committee. However, you know, when there is a recommendation, what we have is the recommendation of the report of the Conflict of Interest Commissioner, and our legislation meets and includes every recommendation that is made in that report. So if there's legislation which is not the same, then you know, it would be very interesting to see how are they not the same when they're meant to be coming from a recommendation from that commissioner. But I'm not able to comment on what happens in legislative management and any decisions that may have happened inside that space. In terms of the chain of correspondence, we have the letters here, and absolutely, you know, we did offer to collaborate, and we did put an inquiry out, but we didn't feel that we got clear direction back from your department on terms of what was happening with that legislation, and we had made it clear that we were proceeding with ours, and in fact we did so with the full support, obviously, of Legislative Council and all of the facilities that are available to us, and that has resulted, and I said, unfortunately, with us coming forward with two pieces. How they compare is something that we can obviously discuss today, but effectively what we've done is brought forward legislation which incorporates every recommendation of the report.
The leader of the third party has an intervention.
Sorry, intervention?
Charlottetown Parkdale has just covered what I said, which is that the letter that we received back from the minister was, in our mind, ambiguous. It was not clear as to whether government was indeed going to come forward with their legislation in the sitting, which is why we went forward with ours.
Minister of Justice.
So I do have the letter here, and the letter says, thank you for your letter dated January 17th, 2018, and your kind words of congratulations. I too look forward to working with you in my added capacity as Minister of Justice and Public Safety and Attorney General. Regarding your inquiry into the status of the proposed amendments to the Conflict of Interest Act, I can confirm that such a bill is on the list of legislation under consideration for introduction in the upcoming legislative session. And I guess what I would say in addition to that is for a member that sat on the committee to somehow now be thinking that, you know, he has some additional insight beyond what the committee has already done and sent a recommendation over on just months before would seem to me to be totally not just out of place, but in the way that your bill was introduced here, frankly, not respectful to the role of that committee and to the speaker.
The member from...
I'm not sure
Charlottetown.
who you were addressing when you tabled your bill, whether it was me or whether it was the speaker who had moved that bill forward. But in one way or another, the comment I took as a slight in terms of the quality of the legislation that was moved forward and the contents of it.
The member from
Maybe
Charlottetown,
I'm wrong, I
Parkdale,
don't
and
know.
Bill's sponsor.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that the minister feels that way. Legislation, when it's tabled, is for the benefit of the province, and for the introduction of legislation is meant to achieve a function of this House, which is to actually bring into law recommendations that have been made by independent, in this case, an independent commissioner of this province, who has made independent recommendations in his authority, in his role. And so our role as legislators here is to bring forward legislation to enact that. And in fact, as we know with the numberings on the bill, that our legislation was tabled first. What I would also point out is that, I find it, I said, unfortunately, you feel that this is personally targeted, or feel some kind of target there, because this is really about doing what is in the best interests of the public. And in that case, I do refer to sort of one of the comments that our commissioner actually made in his report. And what he says in this quote is, a mandatory review of the Conflict of Interest Act, in quoting from his report, a periodic mandatory review of this Act will provide members with an opportunity to consider changes to the Act in a tempered and reflective environment, as opposed to a hasty consideration of amendments initiated in the tempest of a controversy that exposes the legislation as being deficient. The last thing that we need to be seen as is not implementing legislation or recommendations from an independent officer who is thinking that he is providing his opinions that are in the best interest of the province. And that is what his report is quite clearly doing. And we are very happy to be able to bring forward legislation that we feel does just that.
Minister of Justice?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying here, and you're not addressing, is that it would have been quite clear to the leader of your party, the honorable leader of the third party, who sits on Legislative Management Committee, that a bill had been prepared, had been sent to our office, that he had reached out to see what the status of that was, that we had indicated that it was in our plan to move it forward this session, and that in respect for the committee, we did just that. And so you mentioned the opportunity to consider all of these things. There's a committee that's there that's set up to do just that. And that legislation was quite clearly moving forward. Yet, in your own words, you're rushing to get your bill on before we get ours on. And then the comment is, a comment to say, oh, it'll be interesting to see what's in that bill. And we look forward to the opportunity to compare one with the other, like as if there's some, great reveal or whatever there. Well, and I'm not on the Legislative Management Committee, but it would be quite clear to me that that committee is set out as a representative group of this legislature to do the work of the legislature and to come back and make recommendations in respect of how we all conduct ourselves. And what you're really saying in saying that is, we know better than whatever the Legislative Management Committee does.
Okay, but I'd like to...
Bill's sponsor?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to respond. I think that's a really irresponsible remark to make, Minister, to sort of suggest that anybody would know better, particularly from a committee in which I am also not a member and therefore have no idea what happens in. That committee meets in camera. I am, however, having had the opportunity to look at the two pieces of legislation, quite clear that the committee appears to have made decisions in private to exclude things from the legislation, to exclude things that were recommended by that independent officer, which are now not in the legislation brought forward on the recommendation of that committee, which are included in the legislation that we have brought forward. So I would suggest that perhaps the person that knows better in this is the Commissioner from his report, which was tabled 3 years ago in 2015. However, there is an intervention from Chair.
Leader of the third party?
Thank you. And of course, I'm fully aware of the confidences that exist when one participates in an in-camera meeting, which all of Legislative Management Committee meetings are. However, I am at liberty to say that I disagreed with the decision of the committee. I did. And I made my reasons for doing that very clear. I will reiterate them here in this House. I just do not feel that behind closed doors, the recommendations of an independent officer of this legislature should be decided upon. The very people on whom the restrictions of the conflict of interest recommendations from the Commissioner are going to have the most impact, namely the 27 of us who live and work in this legislature. I think the irony of us being able to pick and choose which of those we bring forward is the fact that that's such an obvious conflict of interest is a real problem. So that's why I decided that we would create our own piece of legislation in our office, which clearly reflected all of the recommendations of the Commissioner. And we did that in collaboration with the Commissioner. Met with him on a number of occasions to make sure that the legislation that is before you right now, this bill, is an accurate reflection of the intent of the recommendations that he made in his report of 2015.
Minister of Justice?
There's a lot to unpack there, Chair, in what was just said, and I do wish to kind of take the honourable member up on that. So, I mean, the first statement that I heard was that there's a clear conflict of interest there. And then the second piece of it was, I decided, and that fits with the honourable member from Charlottetown Parkdale, who said that we have put together this legislation and are tabling it now, when she introduced the bill a couple of weeks ago. And further what the honourable member said, I decided that we're going to create our own. So all this clearly indicates to me, you know, there was full knowledge of what was going on at the committee. There was a race to get in there in front of the legislation that was prepared and put forward by the committee. You know, this is a committee that's chaired by the Speaker. The letter came to our office from the Speaker. And, you know, to me, I wonder, and again, particularly with the context in which the comment was made, and folks are free to go back and look at the video in the archives and look at that for themselves. But, you know, what is the true purpose behind this bill coming forward? Why not wait until the bill that was prepared by the committee comes onto the floor to debate the substance of that bill, rather than try and rush to get in there in front and get our bill on and say, oh, look, we did better than the committee. You know, who is representative of this House and is chaired by the Speaker.
Call the
Leader of
hour.
the third party?
Call the hour. The hour's been called.
Extend the hour? Nice try.
C.
It's the product, yeah.
Sorry, Rabble first?
Yep.
No.
Yep.
All right.
So the promoter says C.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, I move that Speaker take the chair, that the chair report progress and beg leave to sit again.
Shall it carry?